Going back to several months before the current events, Jae Ki-young is minding his business in some VIP club when Hee-sung suddenly approaches him and asks what he's doing in there when he doesn't drink. The actor then suddenly starts teasing Jae Ki-young. That's probably because his latest partner has run off again. The athlete is hostile, proving that Hee-sung hit the bull's eye and throws the question back at him. After Hee-sung ordered a martini for himself, he explained to Jae Ki-young how his partner had gotten too clingy, so it wasn't fun for him anymore. He was complaining about how he only wants a soulmate who is perfect for him in every way, and yet it's becoming too hard for him to find that. In return, Jae Ki-young points out how Hee-sung is a playboy who quickly gets bored with his partners and then moves on like nothing. That's to say, Hee-sung is there because he just dumped another one. Then again, it's not like Hee-sung felt any guilt either, saying that it can't be helped, that there will always be someone better, and that isn't a crime to love someone. In his case, he's also the type to pursue anyone who catches his eyes until he's completely possessed them, and it doesn't matter, even if they already belong to someone else. Jae Ki-young mocks Hee-sung as he drinks his soda, although it's not like he's one to talk sense. He's also someone who just uses his partners. These two seem like the total opposite, and yet they are so similar in a way, which is why it's no wonder that they also dislike each other. Soon after, some newcomers enter the club and catch Hee-sung's attention. He then bids goodbye to Jae Ki-young as he stands up to go to them, while wishing him luck with regard to his jinx. Hee-sung also points out how he had heard that Jae Ki-young would be joining their agency soon, so they'd be seeing a lot of each other. Not that Jae Ki-young looks forward to it. Now, going back to several days before the current events, Hee-sung and his manager were at the rooftop of the gym. Hee-sung was smoking while his manager fussed over him, asking about his back and if he could work by the next day. That's when Hee-sung admitted that his back was just fine and barely had a sprain. It's just that he wants to have a session on his own with Dan. So he acted out, "I knew it. This is why I have trust issues with actors. I swear." Anyway, his admittance got his manager upset. After all, he was genuinely worried about his talent. That said, Hee-sung made his manager promise that this scheme would stay between them, not knowing that Jae Ki-young himself was also on the rooftop and who had heard everything. Going back to the present, Jae Ki-young and Dan were in heavy traffic since it was rush hour. Jae Ki-young says how he felt bad for Dan as the trip to Hee-sung's place might take longer than expected. He said that since Dan is, of course, under such distress after he was forced to use the toy from the previous chapter. Dan is trembling and twitching, looking like he's almost on his limit. He's doing his best to hold it in, while Jae Ki-young just mocks him for already becoming such a mess when the toy's setting is still on the low side. And whose fault do you think it is, you delicious-looking son of a bread? It doesn't look like baby Dan registered any of Jae Ki-young's words. All he could think about was how he should have just gotten the taxi instead of taking Jae Ki-young on his offer, probably because of the lack of reaction to his mocking. Jae Ki-young suddenly turns up the toy's setting a notch, and ultimately get a reaction from Dan. Jae Ki-young explains how he got the toy as a joke and wasn't really sure what to do with it. But it turned out great in the end, as he found it pretty fun. Without an ounce of conscience, Jae Ki-young kept increasing the toy's intensity. As expected, it's getting harder and harder for Dan to hold out, especially since the toy keeps hitting a strange spot, feeling like he's just about to reach his limit and ultimately ruin his pants. Dan then pleads for Jae Ki-young to stop the play, saying that he doesn't think he'll be able to keep doing it any longer. But instead of feeling bad and sympathizing, Jae Ki-young just heartlessly increases the intensity yet again. Safe to say, Dan's attempt for sympathy only made his situation worse. Jae Ki-young points out that what Dan is doing is his payment for the ride, and it's the least he could do. By the way, this counts as indecent harassment, right? We can report this B-tard to the police? Yeah. If only he's not hot. Yeah. Never mind I said anything. It had already gotten late when the two escaped the traffic jam. About 10 minutes from Hee-sung's place, Dan is just about to reach his limit. As Dan kept ringing in his seat, fighting for his sanity's sake, Jae Ki-young couldn't be moved and even looked like he was still playing with the setting. Just as Dan felt like he was just a step away from the finish line, he again appealed to Jae Ki-young. Poor baby Dan is in tears as he shudders and trembles, pleading with Jae Ki-young to take the toy out. Dan even admits that he's in the wrong, thinking that Jae Ki-young is only doing this to punish him for whatever wrong he did. Perhaps because Dan's pitiful face actually worked this time, Jae Ki-young suddenly changed the car's direction just as they reached Hee-sung's building. Dan didn't even notice as he was still recovering after the hot B-tard finally gave him a break. When Dan came to his senses, The car was already parked, and Jae Ki-young was already reclining his seat. When Dan asks him where they are, Jae Ki-young responds that nobody comes to the area. That line is, of course, enough clue as to what this hot daddy of a B-tard plans on doing. Long story short, although Dan is finally free from the toy, something bigger just replaces it instead. And now we understand why Jae Ki-young didn't use the usual car he was driving this time. Soon after, the car creaks like there's no tomorrow while Dan is in his birth suit. The total opposite of our hot daddy, who dismisses Dan's worries of being found out for public indecency as him just getting scared. Instead, Jae Ki-young tells him to make more effort if he wants to hurry and go to Hee-sung. Jae Ki-young even grabs Dan's sword, knowing that doing so will help the whole process. When Dan is about to reach his limit, he involuntarily hugs Jae Ki-young, and soon after, they both finish simultaneously. Right after which, and even while in such a pitiful state, Dan tells Jae Ki-young that he's now ready to go. Jae Ki-young is speechless at Dan's determination and sense of responsibility. And so, 5 minutes past 10 in the evening, Hee-sung's doorbell ding-donged. Hee-sung greeted Dan, saying how he thought Dan would have canceled. But Dan just apologizes for coming late and tells Hee-sung that they can now start right away. As the night grew deeper, so did the therapy session. Hee-sung compliments Dan's work and comments that baby Dan is actually stronger than he looks. Oh, you have no idea. As the session proceeds, Hee-sung reflects on how he should have sent Dan home earlier, since from what he could tell on the way Dan walks, he just came from someone's bed, that he guessed was Jae Ki-young. I mean, who else could it be? That said, he wondered at first why Jae Ki-young would suddenly call for Dan earlier and then do it with him. Only to make assumptions soon after that perhaps it's because Jae Ki-young feels jealous. After all, Jae Ki-young had been acting out of character lately, at least not like the Jae Ki-young he's used to. Bieber did say never. Hee-sung found it amusing and felt glad that he had started training again, having discovered a side of Jae Ki-young that we can even call a weakness of some sort. One day, in the VIP Hotel Royal Spa and Sauna, when Jae Ki-young rudely asks him what he's doing there, Hee-sung points out that Jae Ki-young isn't the only VIP the hotel caters to. In fact, Hee-sung comes there himself all the time since it's always nice and empty. Not that Jae Ki-young really cares. Seeing as he's not getting any reaction from the athlete, Hee-sung suddenly tells Jae Ki-young that he has something to ask him. When Jae Ki-young finally gives him attention, Hee-sung starts by saying how he's interested in Dan, and in the process, he's called out for being drunk for suddenly saying that out of the blue. Hee-sung then asks if Jae Ki-young and Dan are really just working together and nothing more. When Jae Ki-young asks him why he wants to know, Hee-sung responds that he just wants to be clear about their relationship. After all, Jae Ki-young isn't the type to let anyone sleep in his place, and yet Dan suddenly moves in with him. He suddenly called Dan over for nothing when Dan ran some errands in town. Hee-sung even dared to point out how Jae Ki-young looked like he didn't want Dan to spend time with Hee-sung at all. That's to say, he just wants to make sure that Jae Ki-young doesn't have any feelings for baby Dan. Well, clearly, Hee-sung crossed the line by running his mouth tactlessly because Jae Ki-young is evidently pissed, as he suddenly grabs Hee-sung's shoulder and threatens him. Jae Ki-young gives him a death glare, but Hee-sung quickly snatches his shoulder away. He was trying and failing miserably to keep his composure as he did. Hee-sung then again tries to confirm that Jae Ki-young has no interest in Dan. He admits that it's because he wants to date Dan properly. That said, Jae Ki-young wouldn't have any problems if Hee-sung made his move. Without waiting for the reply and confirmation from Jae Ki-young, Hee-sung leaves the room, claiming that it's getting too hot for him to handle. Ha! Isn't it because no one's there to protect him from the Jae Ki-young, unlike last time? Then again, Hee-sung is still on the something, and Jae Ki-young himself knows that too. Later that day, everyone in the gym looks at Jae Ki-young warily since the intensity with which he's subjecting the sandbag he's using is no joke. The poor thing. Anyway, all of them are scared just looking at him, especially since he's punching it without saying anything. All except for our little potato, who even wants to volunteer to hold the sandbag for Jae Ki-young. Something that even his sunbaes wouldn't do. Jae Ki-young only stops once the sandbag is in sands. Get it? No. Fine. Whatever. Anyway, Jae Ki-young left to let the other members clean up after him, but not before they marveled at the feat. After all, the sandbag is practically new, yet Jae Ki-young made a tear out of it. Dan approaches him to inform him that the coach is looking for him to talk about his evening classes, But Jae Ki-young didn't even glance at him, making Dan wonder if he was angry again and what it could be about this time. Suddenly, Dan receives a message from Hee-sung, asking him if he's free later in the evening, wondering if Dan can come to check his back again. And because Hee-sung also has something to tell him, Dan agrees to come over, intending for the visit to be quick so as not to get into Jae Ki-young's bad side. Evening came, and Dan was just about to leave when Jae Ki-young called out to him. He then asks if Dan is going to Hee-sung's place. Although Dan said yes, he also wonders how Jae Ki-young found out about it. That's right. How did you find out? Did you bug his phone or something? No. Wait, it's the wrong series again. Dan says he can go to Hee-sung so that Jae Ki-young can stay home and rest. And not because he's afraid of having a repeat of last time. But then Jae Ki-young claims that Hee-sung just called to tell them something had come up and the dude needed to cancel their appointment. This, of course, surprised Dan and made him wonder why Hee-sung would call Jae Ki-young instead of directly informing him. I can tell you why, but I'm scared Jae Ki-young will make a sandbag out of me. So I won't. Jokes aside, Jae Ki-young asks Dan to call Hee-sung himself if he doesn't believe him. But, of course, Dan wouldn't do that. While Dan thinks about how he'll just go some other time, he fails to notice how Jae Ki-young has already moved right before him. Jae Ki-young then asks Dan if he likes the toy that they used the other day. This took Dan aback that he wasn't immediately able to answer, but he did admit shortly after how it was a bit too much, especially since they were in public. That said, Jae Ki-young asks if Dan is okay with it if they're not in public, then advances toward Dan until he has him right against the wall, after which Jae Ki-young does an intimate kabedon while telling Dan that there's something he wants to try with him. And since they're both free tonight, he wonders if Dan will agree. Baby Dan then asks if he's allowed to say no. But we all know the answer to that, don't we? Shortly after, Jae Ki-young sends a message to Hee-sung, telling him that if he wants to be clear about his relationship with Dan, then the actor should come to his place, and come to Jae Ki-young's place he did. Hee-sung is already on Jae Ki-young's floor, complaining about Jae Ki-young suddenly making him drive across town when he's so sleepy. Although since it has something to do with Dan, then it's not like he has any choice. When Hee-sung is right in front of the place, he notices the door is open and comments how it will get Jae Ki-young robbed. Not that really stopped him from entering without a word himself. Well, at least he closed the door on his way in. Anyway, Hee-sung wonders why the place is so quiet when he gets inside and calls out for Jae Ki-young while walking around to look for anybody. Once he makes it to the living room, Jae Ki-young nonchalantly greets him. But because of the situation Dan is in, the actor froze that he can't even return the athlete's greeting. To Hee-sung's horror, he sees Dan in a very indecent position while he's on Jae Ki-young's lap, and the athlete's sword is sheathed in his black hole. Dan's own sword is also being treated with another toy. Seeing as a pair of headphones playing loud music covered his ears and there were blindfolds over his eyes, not to mention the ball in his mouth, Dan didn't make any move, indicating he noticed Hee-sung's arrival. Jae Ki-young then coolly calls Hee-sung to come closer before he can make any sound that would give his presence away. Hee-sung complies and slowly walks toward them while uncomfortably looking at Dan. Without saying anything, Hee-sung pushes Jae Ki-young and dashes away, mentally cursing at Jae Ki-young and calling him a maniac as he hurriedly leaves the place. He even slammed on the door on his way out. That definitely woke him up. Heh. With Hee-sung finally gone, Jae Ki-young and Dan are by themselves. After a while, the ball covering Dan's mouth is undone. Dan asks Jae Ki-young about the door closing and if someone is there with them. Jae Ki-young responds that there wasn't, and although he probably didn't even hear the reply, Dan asks for the blindfold to be taken off as it's becoming scary for him not being able to see anything. He even promises to do whatever Jae Ki-young wants in return. Well, Jae Ki-young did eventually take it off. In fact, he took everything off including the sword, buried in Dan's black hole, but that was it. Jae Ki-young left Dan to fend for himself without saying anything, leaving Dan to wonder. After all, Dan did think that they would keep going. As Dan tries to recover, he wonders what could have gotten into Jae Ki-young, since the big man isn't the type to stop halfway through when they do this. On another day, Dan and Hee-sung were meeting in a public cafe. Although Hee-sung had his disguise on, people still recognized him. Although nobody really approached him either, so the two of them could talk in peace. Hee-sung thanked Dan for meeting him like this, which Dan didn't mind at all, although he was also direct in asking the actor what he wanted to discuss in the first place. Hee-sung then admits that he doesn't actually have any back pains, that he made it all up so he can keep seeing Dan. Therefore, they can just cancel their arrangements going forward. Instead of getting angry like I would, Dan is being so understanding and tells Hee-sung how he's glad he's not hurt. That said, Hee-sung explains that he was supposed to tell Dan how he felt the last time, although he had guessed that he would probably just get rejected, like how Dan would reject him now. Dan flushes as he apologizes and explains that he also plans to cancel their sessions. After all, he needs to focus on Jae Ki-young right now, especially since he's in a bad state lately. Dan can afford to get distracted and compromise Jae Ki-young's treatment further. Also, Dan asks Hee-sung if he can take back all the gifts that he has given him so far. They're all too fancy and expensive for him, and Hee-sung's thoughts were already more than enough. Hee-sung is teary-eyed, having been slapped with the reality, although he had also been expecting it. Dan once again apologizes, saying he enjoyed the time they spent together. But things won't work between them, and Hee-sung will definitely meet someone better than him. Hee-sung resigned to being rejected by saying that Jae Ki-young didn't deserve Dan. Ha, now you're finally saying something that we can agree on. The actor admits that if Dan had shown even the slightest interest in him, Hee-sung would have tried to keep on winning Dan over. Although now, Jae Ki-young just made that impossible. After all, if he did, he would feel like he'd just be putting his life on the line. Ha, it's a good thing they had that conversation a few months back. When Dan worriedly asks if he said that because Jae Ki-young had hit him or something, Hee-sung just points out how he thinks that Jae Ki-young has feelings for Dan. It's quite obvious with how the athlete had been grumpy and pouting this whole time. A pouting Jae Ki-young is actually quite a nice scene to see. Dan didn't say anything in response to Hee-sung's observation and conclusion. Soon after, the two of them cut their meeting short. Later on, Dan walked Hee-sung to his car, and they bid their final goodbyes. Dan then tells Hee-sung that if he ever comes to the gym in the future, he can tell him if he has any pain, and he'll take care of him. Something that he should have done from the start instead of pretending to be hurt. That said, Hee-sung thanks him for the offer and, in return, tells Dan to let him know if Jae Ki-young gives him a hard time, since he can also help him then. Although Dan doesn't think it's likely to happen, he still gives thanks for the offer. Shortly after, Hee-sung finally drives away. As Hee-sung drives away, a bittersweet sigh leaves his lips at the fact that he's been entirely shot down. He then remembers that time when he was shopping for Dan, and he found the doctor staring at a pair of sunglasses. At first, Hee-sung thought that Dan saw something that he liked. Turns out, it was just something that Dan thinks will look good on Jae Ki-young. Hee-sung reflects on the fact that Dan is too good for Jae Ki-young, and that just based on what happened that day. He could tell that Dan himself had caught some feelings for Jae Ki-young as well. The problem is that neither Dan nor Jae Ki-young is honest about their feelings, so there's no telling how things will proceed. Wow, once he stops being an A-hat, this guy's pretty agreeable, isn't he? Shortly after, Hee-sung invites the trio to join him at his table and promises to treat them to whatever they want, which, of course, they gratefully accepted. But after a few rounds of drinking, surprisingly, Dae Gi-yeon and Jun Bi-yam are considered lightweights in front of Hee-sung. The actor looks like he can still keep on drinking despite having already been drinking when the three had first entered the tent earlier. Jun Bi-yam is already down without a care in the world, while Dae Gi-yeon excuses himself to go to the bathroom. Hee-sung is disappointed that these young men, who are younger than him and are all athletes, can't seem to hold their weight. Although if Potato has any say to it, it's just because Hee-sung has an abnormal tolerance to alcohol. Anyway, Potato reflects on how he was supposed to drink only a little tonight, yet he already felt drunk. He doesn't even like Hee-sung, so he doesn't understand why he stayed, not to mention sitting right next to the actor. Suddenly, the drunk Hee-sung asks Potato what he thinks about love, blabbering about how he's not really asking for a lot in his partner, that he just wants someone with a pretty face, a nice personality, and good sexual chemistry with him, someone who he can be happy just by looking at. Unfortunately, the same thing always happens to him. If he finds someone who turns to like him more, he becomes bored, and yet, if Hee-sung likes them, they leave him. He's ready to settle but still can't find his soulmate. Well, I say it's karma. As Hee-sung drowns himself in self-pity, saying how he's probably the problem and that he's just not meant for love, Potato suddenly remembers those times when he's just looking and admiring Jae Ki-young in the background. Suddenly, Potato exclaims that there isn't anything wrong with loving someone. He continues by pointing out how it couldn't be helped, especially if there's someone incredible and cool. Potato even added that although he doesn't really have a chance, he can still cheer that person while wishing for their happiness. That in itself is also considered love. Potato, dear, you do not want to be that hottie's lover. You're too young and innocent to be subjected to such misfortune. Feeling like it's a personal attack on him, Potato goes as far as standing up from his seat to make his point, calling the attention of other customers when he exclaims that if there is anything wrong in showing that kind of love, then something is wrong with Potato himself as well. The point is that Potato can relate to Hee-sung's situation. Hee-sung is speechless at first and just stares at Potato. And once the younger man takes a sit, he asks him if he's drunk and if he's also in the middle of unrequited love. Not that Potato will admit to that, so he just dismisses Hee-sung's inquiries. Potato is saying how one-sided love is also considered love anyway. Therefore, they have no reason to be too harsh on themselves, especially for someone good-looking like Hee-sung. For the second time that day, Hee-sung receives a promised special service at the gym again. Potato offers to hold his mitts for Hee-sung if he comes to visit to relieve stress. Potato was just mumbling about suddenly crying and feeling embarrassed when an epiphany hit Hee-sung. Despite Potato not being Hee-sung's type, he somehow finds him cute. Hee-sung suddenly grabs Potato's face and asks the younger man if he would like to come with him to his place for a nightcap. A nightcap, he says. Well, I guess two broken-hearted people can mend their broken hearts together. At least Potato's in better hands. Although I also feel bad for Hee-sung that he ended up falling for the ones who already had their hearts set on Jae Ki-young. Anyways, with Dae Ki-yoon probably passing out somewhere near a bathroom and Hee-sung and Potato going home for a nightcap, poor Jun Bi-yam is passed out at their table by himself. Meanwhile, back at Jae Ki-young's place, Jae Ki-young is by himself, trying to enjoy the city night view from his room. He remembers the night he confronted Hee-sung, and it made him think that it didn't make any sense for him to suddenly do that in the first place. In fact, he's confused about what he's even doing in his life in general. Eh? Who would have thought I'd have something in common with this hot bread? Anyways, Jae Ki-young's train of thought was suddenly interrupted by a notification on his phone. It was a message from a sports reporter reaching out to Jae Ki-young to ask for a comment regarding an article. Jae Ki-young curses as he shakes in anger, seeing that the article is about him having a critical shoulder injury that could lead to his early retirement. On a different note, let's hope Jae Ki-young doesn't break his phone because of this. If he did, then he'll have to add anger management issues to the critical shoulder injury. The sun was already setting, yet Jae Ki-young's mood didn't improve. If anything, it's getting worse. After beating to a pulp one of the gym members, not just physically but also verbally, Jae Ki-young calls in Dae Hee-yoon to spar with him. Dae Hee-yoon, of course, had no choice but to follow. Already understanding where the bad mood is coming from, Coach Teddy Bear scolds the other members, who are staring warily at Jae Ki-young, to focus on their workouts. As the practice continues, the support staff are on standby, including Dan, who also thinks that everyone is tense because of Jae Ki-young's bad mood, which probably has to do with the article from the previous chapter. Later that evening, after the practice is done for the day, the coach huddles everyone up and tries to cheer them in an Iron Hand way. He tells them that even if they're scared of Jae Ki-young, they can't just stay down all the time, which is why he will give them a boost. Coach Teddy Bear and Coach Yosip then show them the new team gear that had just arrived, complete with jacket and towels. And just like that, everyone's moods improved as they fought over the jackets. Coach Teddy Bear also forces Jae Ki-young to wear his jacket to ensure it fits. Dan couldn't help but admire Jae Ki-young after seeing him wearing the jacket. Indeed, Jae Ki-young looks good in anything. Meanwhile, the coach notices Dan staring at Jae Ki-young, and after looking at the now empty box where the jackets were just minutes ago, he suddenly exclaims his apology, making Dan flinch. He explains how they placed the order before Dan joined them, so he's not included in the count, and there were no extra pieces, as it's a limited quantity, and a new order would take at least a month to fill. The coach genuinely felt terrible, although Dan didn't mind. And when the rest of the members heard this, quite a number of them offered to give Dan theirs instead. As Dan tries to decline their offerings politely, Jae Ki-young suddenly throws his jacket in Dan's direction and moodily tells everyone to shut up. He then tells everyone to quietly go out since they're going to have a meeting. Dan asks Jae Ki-young if it's really fine for him to take his jacket, but Jae Ki-young doesn't even acknowledge him and instead just heads for the meeting room. As the coach bids everyone home nicely, Yosip greets the people with whom they're going to have a meeting. Dan is still reluctant as he looks at the jacket he just received. He then tells Coach Teddy Bear that he'll tidy up a bit as he waits for them to finish the meeting. The night progressed, and the meeting proceeded. As Dan mops the floor, he glances at Jae Ki-young's jacket. He still can't believe that Jae Ki-young would give him his jacket. He reflects on how his employer had already done so much for him. Dan owes him big time for paying all his debts, letting him move into his place, and even covering Grandma's hospital bills. although he still finds Jae Ki-young scary, and sleeping with him can be a bit too much to handle at times. Despite himself, Dan finds it manageable now. No one has ever helped him as much in his life as Jae Ki-young did. He's already getting so complacent with his work that his past self could never have imagined this would ever be possible. Dan then remembers Hee-sung's words about Jae Ki-young having feelings for him. Dan knows that Hee-sung was serious when he said it, but Dan can't imagine Jae Ki-young ever thinking of him that way. As Dan reaches out and wears the jacket, which is too big for him, he reflects that to Jae Ki-young, he's nothing more than just a tool. Meanwhile, inside the conference room, the meeting is in full swing as Jae Ki-young, the coaches, Jae Ki-young's manager, and his attorney try to think of how they will handle the situation. Ms. Attorney explained that the website that published the article didn't contact the agency for confirmation. Therefore, it's possible that someone from the hospital sold them the information. It was absurd that someone would do that, especially since that was personal medical information. Legally, they must take measures against the site and the hospital. Then again, the damage is already done. Seeing is instead of sympathy. The public opinion leans towards grim satisfaction that usually only anti-fans possess. Hearing that, Jae Ki-young, of course, lost his composure and slammed his fist on the table. He was swearing at the ones who dared to slander him. Coach Teddy Bear and Yosef quickly scolded him for his temper. After all, they have guests over. Ms. Attorney was surprised by Jae Ki-young's outburst, although she still managed to keep her composure, unlike someone else. She further explains that legal actions against those who wrote more defamatory comments will be pursued. In fact, their team had already expected this response from the public, which was why the information about the injury was never announced. What's important now is to show everyone how strong and fit Jae Ki-young is, regardless of his injury. The manager then tells them they just got a call from the MSC matchmaker, asking if they might want to do a non-title match with the middleweight champion, Dominic Hill. The said athlete might be older, but he's still considered a living legend. Therefore, winning against him will definitely make a significant impact. In short, he's the perfect opponent to prove to the world that Jae Ki-young still has what it takes. The problem is that he's a middleweight, so Jae Ki-young has to drop a lot of weight to qualify for the match. Coach Teddy Bear voiced his concerns. After all, Jae Ki-young is strict about monitoring his weight, so he asks Jae Ki-young if he thinks he can do it, as it won't be easy. The thing is, there aren't any noteworthy opponents still left in Dominic's weight class, and that's why they had to look for champions from another. Although the usual scenario is that someone puts on weight to qualify for a higher weight class, having Jae Ki-young be the one to adjust would also be interesting. That said, Jae Ki-young will have a very low energy as he works towards dropping all the excess body fat. Then again, if he does win, then it'll only make the victory more worth it. The manager added that the match will be held in America after a month, and so he asks Jae Ki-young if he's up for it. Despite his coach's concern, Jae Ki-young decided to do it anyway. All he needs to do is prove himself, and the best way to show everyone that is through a match. So, of course, they have to do it. The coaches were speechless, but it's not like they can really go against his decision. The next day, Coach Teddy Bear informs Dan about the away match and how he will also be coming with them. The coach explained that they needed him to go with them to avoid repeating what happened last time in Busan. Right. Ahem. Also, their group will only consist of Jae Ki-young, the coaches, Dae-hyun, Dan, and Potato to avoid distractions. They had a raffle to see who would be coming for the last spot, and Potato got lucky. That said, Dan is thinking about how it will be his first time going overseas and how he should also tell Grandma about it. The coach reminds him to do whatever he must to prepare and not forget his passport. He also asks Dan to be more patient with Jae Ki-young since his mood will only worsen by the day since he has to lose much weight. This is why I don't diet. I'll feel sorry for everyone around me. Then again, the coach didn't need to explain or ask Dan about it, as Dan had already experienced it himself. Jae Ki-young is definitely already worse than he usually is. He just can't seem to get enough sleep, and yet he has to train more than ever since he has a lot of weight to lose. Even the situation at home is no different. This one time, Jae Ki-young was in the bathtub, and Dan was kind enough to get him some water to drink. After all, Jae Ki-young had been there for a long time and needed to keep hydrated. But Jae Ki-young just moodily smacks the cup away, causing the cup to shatter on the floor. Dan gathers and throws the pieces of the cup on the bin and, in the process, accidentally cuts himself. Dan thinks that Jae Ki-young is more sensitive than ever, and since they only had less than a month left, even he could tell the schedule was too unrealistic. Not even for someone like Jae Ki-young. Just then, Dan noticed Jae Ki-young approach him from behind. Without a word, Jae Ki-young had Dan against the counter and started to do it. Saying that Dan is hurting is an understatement since this scene happens daily. But even though it's hard for Dan to do this daily, he knows it's worse for Jae Ki-young. And so the days passed, and the team soon landed in America. In a press conference for the MFC 274, a stunning host had the privilege to introduce and interview Jae Ki-young. But since our hot daddy swings the other way, it doesn't really matter. Anyways, there was no doubt that Jae Ki-young is quite popular even abroad. And seeing as both the athletes are legendary champions, everyone was excited for the match, despite it being a non-title match. Even the MFC officials are ecstatic to have Jae Ki-young flying all the way to America. It was amazing that although Jae Ki-young was not training, he still couldn't have a moment of rest, thanks to all the interviews, courtesy calls, and other things. And at the end of it all, he's still as yummy-licious as he was a month ago. That's just how incredible he is. Not long after, training day commences. Dae Hee-yoon and Potato are doing laps with Jae Ki-young, although it just looks like they're trying to catch up and failing. When Dae Hee-yoon tried to point out that they had already done 20 laps, Jae Ki-young took it as Dae Hee-yoon complaining. So Jae Ki-young tells him to just stop if he's just going to mess up his pace, which is out of the question, of course. And it is just me. But that cap looks really cool on him. Excuse me while I wipe my mouth. Hem. And so, hours and days went by. Jae Ki-young spent them training and losing weight. It was a given that he'd be ruder and more sensitive, especially to Dan. For some reason, even Coach Teddy Bear felt bad about it, although all he could do was thank Dan for being so understanding. As for Dan, despite putting up with Jae Ki-young's behavior, he still feels like he needs to do something extra to help the athlete. For him, it wasn't enough that he helps with his cooldowns and relaxing his muscles before bed. Although, as we all know, the real reason he's there is to help with Jae Ki-young's jinx. Night came, and both Dae Hee-yoon and Potato were down on their bed. Potato is disappointed that he couldn't do some tourist stuff since it's training with Jae Ki-young for them from dawn to dusk. Not that they can complain. After all, that's exactly why they're there in the first place. At least they're getting a cheer from Dan. Dae Hee-yoon then asks Potato how he's holding up. After all, it's not easy to keep up with a world-class athlete like Jae Ki-young. Potato says that he can handle the training. The hardest part is how scary Jae Ki-young has gotten. Just earlier today, he almost got into a fight with the local coaches. Well, Jae Ki-young had always been prickly before his matches. It's just this time, it was worse. His opponent being good is part of the pressure, of course. Not to mention being in a new environment. Then, there's all the talk about Jae Ki-young's injury. It's no wonder he turned irrational more than usual. It's so hard to make him happy these days. It's always walking on eggshells with him. Dan was just listening to the two, then suddenly said that he envied them both for being able to do something for Jae Ki-young in a practical way. He thinks that he's not much help and that it would have been better if they'd brought another team member in his place. Dae Hee-yoon and Potato strongly disagree, however. After all, despite this being his first match abroad, Dan can still keep up with them and closely watch Jae Ki-young's needs every second of the day. Dan is still reluctant, so Dae Hee-yoon suggests they relax with some midnight snack. It seems the two of them went with the coaches earlier to pick some ramyeon and stuff, things that they couldn't eat openly because of Jae Ki-young's diet. The best part is that Jae Ki-young doesn't even need to know. Listening to all that stuff, there's no wonder that Dan's stomach would growl. And so, the midnight snack party commences. Meanwhile, Jae Ki-young is in his room and trying to sleep. But because of how sensitive his hearing is, the rattling and clinking and laughing from the trio's room reaches his ears. Before they know it, Jae Ki-young bursts into their room while they're already in the middle of the party. Jae Ki-young is menacing as he asks them what they are doing, that he can hear them all the way from his room. Having found what the ruckus was all about, Jae Ki-young was a lot calmer as he scolded them for eating junk food. Dae Hee-yoon apologizes for the group while Dan promises that they'll keep it down. But Jae Ki-young, being the sarcastic beatard that he is, just picks up one of the soda cans and tells them to continue with what they were doing since it's the best way for them to help him keep in peak condition. And as he did, he poured the contents of the can on Dan's head. Even then, Dan was the one who apologized to him. Jae Ki-young then finally leaves the room after a final warning to the group, and once again, they try to apologize. As soon as Jae Ki-young left, Potato and Dae Hee-yoon dashed toward Dan in concern. They were saying how Jae Ki-young is being too much, even though it's true that they're at fault. And what about them? What all Dan could care about is how Jae Ki-young is a light sleeper, not to mention already being under so much pressure. He couldn't help feeling upset that instead of helping, he just made things worse for Jae Ki-young. And so, Another tense day turned into the next. On the day before the big match, it's just 12 hours until weigh-in, the real thing starts. This time, they really need to get serious about dropping his weight, which means they need to lose 7 kilos in just 12 hours. And here we are, struggling to lose just a kilo in a day, or is it just me? Anyway, the day proceeded with them doing everything they could to dehydrate Jae Ki-young, whether by having him stay in a bathtub full of hot water or in heated mattress pads with thick blankets and towels. Round after round, they did it, but Jae Ki-young didn't complain. After sweating so much, Dan couldn't help but observe how Jae Ki-young looked so weak, something he had never seen before. He felt bad that Jae Ki-young still had to keep doing it and couldn't even make himself look at him. Dan was helping Jae Ki-young wipe down the sweat when Jae Ki-young noticed Dan turn away. Jae Ki-young asks Dan why he would do that, and when Dan responds that it's because he feels bad for him, of course, Jae Ki-young takes it the wrong way. Dan tries to recover himself, but Jae Ki-young just tells him to leave, the Jae Ki-young way. Coach Teddy Bear heard it and got angry in Dan's stead, but Dan just told him he'd just go. And as if nothing happened, Jae Ki-young tells the coach that he's ready to go another round. And Dan, he gets out of the room and silently cries by himself. But all their efforts and heartaches paid off when dusk came, and Jae Ki-young managed to make the required weight for the weigh-in. Praises were given to him for dropping that much weight, although, of course, he'll be regaining all that by tomorrow. Still, the fact is the match is on. Right after the weigh-in, Jae Ki-young stuffed himself with food and shakes. He looked much better now, and even his mood greatly improved. As everyone was congratulating and praising him for recovering so fast, Dan still kept to himself at the back. Suddenly, the doorbell ding-donged, and Dan went to get it. Turns out it was a Korean MFC staff member who came to deliver an extra nutrition shake for Jae Ki-young. Dan brought it in and told the group about it. When the coach told him they had already brought the right amount of shakes earlier, Dan said he'd just return it to the staff. But the coach just tells him to drink it instead, since it could be that they really have some extra and everyone has eaten already. Plus, Dan could really use it, since he doesn't even seem to be eating well ever since they arrived. And so, Dan did. Not long after, everyone is sent back to their rooms and told to get some rest for the big day tomorrow. Dae-hyun, Potato, and Dan were on their way to their room when Dan suddenly started feeling strange, as if his body was burning up. So much so that he suddenly fell on the floor trembling. Potato and Dae-hyun rushed toward Dan and worriedly asked him what was wrong. Once they were back in their room, they had Dan lay on the bed. Stroking his forehead, Potato realized that Dan was burning up. With his face beet red, Potato wonders how Dan can still hold up, but Dan explains that it could just be that he's coming down with a cold. He did feel dizzy earlier, but he's feeling better now that he's lying down. He still looked bad for a mere cold, though, so Dae-hyun had his doubts. Potato then guessed that it could be an allergic reaction, so he asked Dan if he ate something weird. But Dan responded that he didn't. That's when Potato remembers the nutrition booster from earlier. Since that's the only possible culprit, Dan accepts that conclusion. After all, nutrition shakes do raise one's body temperature. Once again, Dae-hyun had doubts, since even the protein shakes do raise the temperature. The shake he had was supposed to be for dehydration. As Potato asks Dan if his throat feels ticklish or not, Dae-hyun suggests that they better have Dan get checked out at the clinic downstairs. But Dan refused, insisting that it was not that bad and that he was feeling much better now that he was in bed. That said, Dan insists on just taking a nap, and if he still feels bad when he wakes up, then he agrees to go. Dae-hyun then suggests that they at least let the coaches and Jae Ki-young know. Not wanting to cause any more distraction for Jae Ki-young, Dan strongly insists that what happened to him should stay between them. Plus, the match is tomorrow, and all of them need to get some rest. Dan then pointed out how Dae-hyun and Potato looked exhausted and thought they should really go to sleep. Seeing as that really was the case, they gave in, but only after they made Dan promise to wake them up later tonight if he still feels bad. Potato even offers him to take some cold meds. Later that evening, it was still almost 8:15, but Potato and Dae-hyun were already peacefully snoring. Dan tried to do the same, but to no avail. The discomfort he's feeling is just getting worse by the second. Dan's whole body feels so hot that it feels like his entire body is beating in sync with his heart. To make matters worse, his sword keeps on being alert for some reason. Dan wonders if the shake he drank earlier did, in fact, have some strange side effects. And so, in his attempt to alleviate the pain, he locks himself inside the bathroom. Dan hopes that if he releases it, then perhaps things will get better. However, when he tried to touch his sword, he realized it had become more sensitive than usual, which gives him more reason to do something about it, or he won't be able to get any sleep at all. Biting on his shirt so as not to make any noise, Dan starts to take care of his sword. It was awkward for him at first since he doesn't usually do it, but it's not like he had any choice. Eventually, Dan managed to release some tartar sauce. But the thing is, all of it happened in just a span of 10 minutes. And the worst part is that, once he settled back into his bed, he noticed that despite dispelling his tartar sauce earlier, the sword was still on alert. In fact, it looks like it just got worse, too. Dan doesn't understand what's happening to his body anymore, but one thing he knows is that he needs to have a release. Just as he was about to return to the bathroom, Potato suddenly sat up and walked into the bathroom half asleep. And that's when Dan finally accepted it. What he has isn't just a cold, something far worse than that actually. Because right now, all he could think about was doing it. And now that he already had some idea of what was happening, he didn't hesitate to do what needed to be done. With Potato still in the bathroom and Dae-Hyun still snoring without a care in the world, Dan tries to service his own sword with his hands. And when that isn't enough, he tries to remember how Jae Ki-young did it in the past and soon after. Dan is also treating his black hole and Nip Nops. He tried to be as inconspicuous as he could and eventually reached the top. Still, he needed more, but he had no more strength left to do it again by himself. Just as he was thinking about how to take care of it, his phone vibrated. It was a text message from Jae Ki-young telling him to go to his room at 11, which was still about 2 hours away. Meanwhile, in Jae Ki-young's room, it was only 3 minutes past 9. He was trying to relax by visualizing his fight with Dominic when it was cut short by his doorbell going off. Safe to say Jae Ki-young is about to give the culprit hell as he opens the door. But then Dan suddenly rushed toward Jae Ki-young, resulting in them falling to the floor. Jae Ki-young is just about to give him an earful for coming so early, but Dan didn't really register it. He's already in tears as he touches Jae Ki-young's banana and tells him how he can't take it anymore. For the first time since these two started this relationship they had, it was Dan willingly coming to Jae Ki-young to be done in. And did I mention that he's quite demanding too? Well, they're in America, so they should do things they don't usually do in Korea. Heh. Jae Ki-young's immediate reaction is that Dan has gone crazy. This is not the usual Dan he's used to after all. But Dan won't let that be a hindrance. Now that he has finally found an effective way to help him overcome whatever he's going through, he'll cling to it. And so, Dan points out how Jae Ki-young brought him there for his jinx anyway, so they can just do it now. Well, Jae Ki-young is speechless. Dan is, after all, so fussy and always flinching whenever they do it. So, what gives? Not that he doesn't like it. In fact, he found the whole situation amusing. But being the mean son of a bread that he is, of course, he's not going to make it easier for our baby. Despite not being an actor, he can act when needed. Jae Ki-young tells Dan that he doesn't want to do it, at least not yet. He did tell Dan to come at 11, so Dan can just return after a couple of hours and play alone while waiting. Now that just made Dan produce another batch of fresh tears as he explained how he tried, but it didn't work. That he really didn't want to bother Jae Ki-young's rest, but there's no helping it since he really wants a release. And that was all that this petard of a crook needed to hear. Jae Ki-young tells Dan to get him into the mood, and only then will he decide if he'll agree to do it ahead of schedule. Safe to say, Dan wasn't given any choice. Then again, turns out Dan doesn't dislike the idea. While Dan services Jae Ki-young, he's also servicing himself with his hand. And you bet Jae Ki-young is enjoying every second of it. This Dan is so unlike the Dan that he's used to, making Jae Ki-young wonder if Dan had eaten something weird. But see, Dan didn't seem to hear anything that Jae Ki-young had said. In fact, when Jae Ki-young pulls his head off the banana, the first thing that comes out of Dan's mouth is if he can now have the banana for himself. Is it wrong for me to find this whole situation hot? I must be crazy. Maybe I also ate something weird. Anyways, Jae Ki-young doesn't seem to be satisfied yet. And so, he made Dan give him service again, and with so much intensity this time. Jae Ki-young even uses his leg to ensure Dan doesn't make unnecessary movements just as he is about to reach his limit. And because he's a jerk, he made Dan swallow his tartar sauce. And Dan did. As soon as Dan finished doing that, though, he again asked Jae Ki-young if they could do it now. Once again, Jae Ki-young is astonished by Dan's shamelessness, but that's not to say that he hates it. And so, about 20 minutes before the original schedule, the two were already busy riding and dirtying the sheets. Jae Ki-young comments on how Dan seems to have become a sauce factory by now. He even jokes that perhaps Dan won't be able to produce any sauce after tonight anymore. But none of those comments register to Dan. In fact, all he can think about is how he feels so hot and that he has no idea what he's doing and saying anymore. It feels like he's going to melt into a puddle at any moment. Just as Jae Ki-young reaches Dan's sweet spot, Dan tries to ask for a break. But this time, it was Jae Ki-young who refused to stop. They continued doing the Waka Waka to the point that Dan felt like he was about to pee. But instead of letting him go, Jae Ki-young encouraged Dan to just do it in bed. After all, it's already filthy enough as it is, plus Jae Ki-young is also curious whether Dan is going to produce water or sauce. To speed up the process, Jae Ki-young even got a hold of Dan's sword, and soon after, Dan made a fountain by himself. He involuntarily clenched as he did, resulting in Jae Ki-young filling Dan's black hole with his sauce. Dan, of course, regretted it soon after. Just for a brief moment, though, because, for the most part, he felt good. Too good, in fact, that he's totally lost it. Not only did he start kissing Jae Ki-young as if coaxing him to do more, but he was also being honest about feeling so good and wanting more. And Jae Ki-young, having been coaxed, gave exactly what Dan wanted. When Dan is about to reach his limit again, Jae Ki-young changes position, resulting in some of Dan's waterworks getting into Jae Ki-young's face. Under normal circumstances, Jae Ki-young would have probably pushed Dan away and cursed at him. But see, this is not one of those normal circumstances. Seeing as Dan keeps on getting bolder whenever he produces a fountain, this time, Dan suddenly admits that he loves Jae Ki-young. And although the big man didn't really take his words at face value, he didn't reject Dan kissing him on the lips either. As for Dan, although he forgot that he just confessed as soon as he did, it doesn't really matter. Because right now, all he wants is to do it more. Who would have thought our shy baby Dan could be such a perv, right? Well, I blame Daddy Jae Ki-young. He's the biggest perv of them all, after all. The next day, and while Jae Ki-young did his shower and prepared himself for the big day, Dan remained asleep without a care in the world. Not that it mattered because, for the first time in weeks, Jae Ki-young was happy. I bet it was because of the confession he received last night. Fast forward to a couple of hours after Jae Ki-young left, Dan finally woke up and wondered what he was doing in Jae Ki-young's room. Although all he could remember was falling asleep in there last night. How convenient, Mr. Closet Perv. Anyways, as Dan tries to get off the bed with an aching back, he glances at the clock and realizes that it's almost 10:30. This sent Dan into a panic since the match would start at 11. Thus, while Jae Ki-young took his time preparing earlier that day, Dan did not. 30 minutes later, Dan arrived just in time for Jae Ki-young to enter the ring. Dan approached Potato, apologized for being late, and asked about Jae Ki-young's condition. Potato assures him that Jae Ki-young is in good form. I mean, after everything they did the previous night, that muffin F-tard can't not be in good form. At least for Dan's back's sake. Anyways, Potato is now more concerned about Dan's condition, though. He was told that Dan fell asleep in Jae Ki-young's room, so he let him sleep in. This time, Dan assured him that he was alright and wouldn't miss this match for anything. Hyped, Potato started to give it his all in cheering for Jae Ki-young like the avid fan that he is. As for Dan, he worries about Jae Ki-young's injury like the wifey that he is. Dan mentally scolds himself for sleeping in since it's his responsibility to ensure that Jae Ki-young's body is in good shape before entering the ring. All Dan can do for now is hope that Jae Ki-young makes it through in one piece. And so, on the referee's signal, the match began. As the match proceeded, the commentator did his best doing his job of narrating the obvious facts. It would seem that Jae Ki-young is at a disadvantage. After all, his opponent is not only more experienced than he is, there's also all the talk about Jae Ki-young's injury. Therefore, this match would prove to the world that he's still very much in his element. Dominic was the first to throw a punch but was easily blocked by Jae Ki-young, after which it was Jae Ki-young's turn to throw a kick that Dominic also blocked. Just then, the American veteran threw a feint in Jae Ki-young's right, which resulted in him getting caught on a solid elbow to his left and followed by an uppercut. Despite the consecutive attacks, Jae Ki-young still managed to stand on his feet, and although the elbow attack left Jae Ki-young with a bleeding eye that no doubt will affect his vision in the next round, Jae Ki-young is far from giving up. While the rest of his crew patch up his injury, Dan is horrified. This is why faint-hearted wifeys shouldn't be allowed to watch their hubbies fight. Just saying. Anyways, just as the bell runs for the next round, Jae Ki-young heads straight to Dominic with a vengeance, throwing consecutive lefts, leaving his shoulder injury throbbing. His opponent didn't miss this chance, however, and started throwing consecutive kicks on Jae Ki-young's left shoulder. Jae Ki-young tried his best to block it until he saw an opportunity and gave Dominic a swift straight. Not losing momentum, Jae Ki-young throws consecutive punches again, even when Dominic is already down. The barrage didn't stop until the referee tried to intervene. And just like that, our hot daddy emerged victorious, once again proving himself as the undisputed champion. From the commentator's perspective, Jae Ki-young deliberately exposed his left shoulder to lure his opponent in, after which he swiftly launched his counterattack. It was indeed a very exciting match that ended with Dominic being a good sport. And I can't believe I actually managed to do a decent narration of it. Thank you, Ippo. Anyways, the avid fan Potato is crying tears of joy at how cool and amazing his Hee-young is. On the other hand, Wifey Dan's legs just gave out under him, relief written all over his face. However, it didn't seem to last long as someone suddenly tapped on his shoulder. On the team's way to the locker room, Coach Teddy Bear congratulates Jae Ki-young for a job well done. He then asks the young athlete if he has other injuries and if his shoulder is fine. The shoulder in question is, in fact, throbbing, but Jae Ki-young didn't say or show any sign of it. Tsk. This is why I have a love-hate relationship with this hot muffin F-tard, albeit one-sided. Anyways, Potato suddenly approached the coach to tell him that he saw Dan walking away with the security. The coach explains that they probably took him for questioning regarding the nutrition shake. And since nobody actually told him anything about it, Jae Ki-young asked what it was about, and so Coach Teddy Bear started to tell him what happened. Meanwhile, blood was drawn from Dan for testing, after which the interrogation concerning the nutrition shake he took yesterday began. The interrogator began by explaining how the MFC did not provide the shake and how it contained prohibited substances that would ground any athlete for disqualification. And thus, they plan on handing over to the forensics the supplements as well as a sample of Dan's blood to help in the investigation. After such a lengthy explanation, the interrogator started barraging Dan with the standard inquiries without giving him a chance to answer. And as if it wasn't enough that Dan is interrogated alone together with at least 5 burly, intimidating men, even the regular security guards started questioning Dan as well. When Dan tries to explain to them that he can't understand English and is asking for an interpreter, the interrogator suddenly raises his voice, and the questions quickly turn into accusatory ones instead. After all, it's the first time that they've seen Dan among Jae Ki-young's team, so they're not quite familiar with his face. And so, they accuse Dan of being in cahoots with the people who deliberately did this to trick Jae Ki-young. Like, what the flake? It's you who failed in your job, and now you're accusing the victim? Did your brain cells leave along with your hair follicles, you muffin flickers? Poor baby Dan froze up being put on a spot like this. He doesn't know what to do in this situation, as he worries that he might say something that would affect Jae Ki-young later. But since Jae Ki-young is still the ML of this series despite being a toxic betard, he came just in time to rescue our baby, as he should. Jae Ki-young bangs the door as he comes in and immediately calls for Dan. Non-perturbed at first, the flaking skinheads started to justify their actions, appealing that they only did it out of concern for Jae Ki-young's safety. Not that it really mattered because Jae Ki-young himself started his rant, which is basically the same as my rant from earlier. Although it saddens me to be lumped together with this betard for any reason, he's still my hot daddy, so let's just settle with the fact that great minds think alike. Anyways, the moment that Jae Ki-young started getting angry and pointing out everything they did wrong, they flinched, since it's not like he said anything wrong, especially about the fact that because of their carelessness, the fight today wouldn't have happened, and it's gonna be all their fault. After finishing his rant and the flicker apologized, Jae Ki-young once again called Dan over to him. When the interrogator tries to stop them from leaving, saying that they're still not finished with the questioning since they're still not sure about his relationship with Dan, Jae Ki-young is quick to tell them that Dan is one of his own. With that, Jae Ki-young started to leave while grumbling about how the flicker was asking dumb questions, and once again the flicker apologizes and promises that they will get to the bottom of this. All the while, Dan is somehow taken aback by what Jae Ki-young just said. Anyways, Dan silently followed Jae Ki-young. After a while, Jae Ki-young broke the silence by saying that Dan's strange behavior last night was actually because he was drugged. Dan apologizes for the trouble and is just about to ask about Jae Ki-young's shoulder when they're suddenly not alone anymore. Reporters flock before Jae Ki-young, all wanting to take pictures and ask questions. As the impromptu interview commenced, Dan was left admiring Jae Ki-young from behind. He reflects on what had happened earlier. Although Dan didn't really understand most of what was being said in the room earlier, he did understand one part of it, and that was when Jae Ki-young said that Dan was one of his own. And that line alone is enough for Dan to think that he means something to Jae Ki-young. to the point that he'll even announce he's one of his people. And of course, we'll forget all the insults and rudeness he put you through for the past weeks, just like that. Anyways, it's also thanks to that one line that now Dan is finally starting to come into terms with his feelings for Jae Ki-young, which Jae Ki-young himself already knows.